As we continue our journey now through the American Revolution, we have come to the point when the Continental Congress is going to have to really seriously deal with the question of independence. Fighting has already broken out. Are they going to support that? Are they going to take this to the next level? Or are they still going to try to appease Britain and see if the situation can be resolved in some other way? Those four independents gradually are going to grow in strength in the Continental Congress. There are going to be three events that are going to help their cause. One was the passage of the Prohibitory Act by Britain in December of 1775. That restricted all American trade, called for the seizure of all American ships, and defined American resistance as rebellion and treason. That meant, quite simply, that these men could now be tried for treason. And if convicted, that meant they would be executed. Their families would lose all their property. So this has now become extremely serious. The second event was the passage of a pamphlet called Common Sense, which was written by Thomas Paine in January of 1776. Paine was a very persuasive writer, and in this pamphlet, he essentially said, look, fighting has already been taking place. Men have already died. You need to really step up and take this resistance that is already existing to the next level and declare independence. This pamphlet becomes a bestseller throughout the colonies and convinces many people that maybe it is time to take that leap. The third event that is going to push the delegates toward independence will be the news that Britain has hired Hessian troops to come to the colonies to help try to put down the fighting and to stop it. Hessians were from the German Principality of Hesse, and basically their prince would hire them out to any country that was willing to pay him for their services. They were the mercenaries of their time. They had a very scary reputation. People did not want to go up against the Hessians. So to hear that Britain had done that, it meant that that now this was not a family quarrel anymore. They had taken it to a new level, and they were bringing in these mercenaries to fight people who had always considered themselves to be as British as anybody living in England. So the situation is changing. That gives strength to those delegates in Congress who are really interested in independence. In April of 1776, the Congress declared that the ports of America were now open to the world. And then on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee in Congress presented a resolution, quote, that these united colonies are and of rights ought to be free and independent states. So now, Congress being Congress, they set up a committee because they felt that they needed to have a document that they could present to the world explaining what the king and parliament had done to them and why they were taking this most dramatic step of declaring independence and going to war. No colony anywhere in the world had ever successfully rebelled against their mother country and survived to tell the tale. So they are very concerned that they need to explain this all in great detail and hopefully receive support from the world if possible. So they form a committee. This committee is going to consist of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. By custom, because Jefferson received the most votes, he is going to become the main author of this document, and of course this document is the Declaration of Independence. They debate it and edit it after he writes it, and then finally on July 2nd, the vote was taken for independence and passed unanimously with only New York abstaining. And then 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration was approved, sent to the printer, and 4 days later it was read to the people at the State House in Philadelphia. The American Revolution was now official. Now, while that was happening, Washington has his hands full because he is in New York with the Continental Army. The British Army is in the process of invading. The Congress wants him to hold New York City. He really doesn't feel like that's going to be a possibility, but he knows he's got to try because the Congress is pushing him. So you will have a battle. He manages to escape with most of his army intact. It is a definite loss for him. And he's going to go on this retreat. And he retreats across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. And he's about to go into winter quarters. In that time period, the roads would be so fierce that troops always went into winter quarters and they didn't fight while the winter was going on. Washington knew that if he went into winter quarters without some type of a victory, that morale was so bad, and a lot of the commissions that these soldiers had signed when they had joined the army were about to run out. He felt that without a victory, that the army would simply disappear during the winter and he wouldn't have a army at all once spring came. So he launches a surprise attack on Christmas night, 1776. He slipped across the Delaware River with some 2,400 men, and near dawn at Trenton, New Jersey, surprised a garrison of 1,500 Hessians. It is a victory for the Americans, total rout. And then at nearby Princeton on January 3rd, the Americans met and drove off 3 regiments of British redcoats, British soldiers, and then went into winter headquarters. So this was 2 very important victories for the American Army to keep them going on. In 1777, General Burgoyne of the British Army came up with an idea of trying to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. Britain still had this feeling that most of the problems were centered in New England, and if they could kind of separate those colonies from the rest of the colonies, that this whole situation would die out. Burgoyne tried to coordinate basically an attack between using 3 armies, and even in this day and time with modern communications, it is very difficult to actually have different armies coming from different directions show up at a designated point at a designated time. It was incredibly difficult to try to pull off something like that during that time period, and it's not going to happen. At Saratoga, New York, Burgoyne is going to be surrounded by forces led by General Horatio Gates, and on October 17, 1777, he surrenders with 5,000 troops. This is going to be considered the turning point of the American Revolution. This is the first major overwhelming victory for the Americans. It is incredibly important because it gave the French the feeling and the belief that the Americans were going to keep fighting, that they did possibly have a chance to pull this off and win their independence. The French had been secretly sending them supplies, but had not come out publicly. They didn't want the colonies to suddenly just go belly up and then France be left holding the bag against Britain. So they had not wanted to make a public statement saying that, yes, they supported the colonies. Now they're going to sign a couple of treaties, and they are going to begin to provide support publicly. And so by June of 1778, Britain and France were at war. In 1779, Spain enters the war as an ally of France, but not of the United States. And then in 1780, Britain declared war on the Dutch, who continued in a profitable trade with the French and Americans. So this has now become another one of those world wars. And it's getting out of hand as far as the British are concerned. This is going to become more and more expensive. And Washington simply has to keep an army in the field long enough for Britain to get tired of trying to do this, get tired of the expense, for the people back in Britain to say, no, we don't need to do this anymore, for Britain to finally maybe decide, okay, maybe independence is the best way to go with this. The last 2 years of the war are going to be concentrated in the southern colonies. Britain felt that there were a lot of loyalists down there that would flock to their armies. And so that's where most of the fighting will happen. They're going to take Charleston on May 12, 1780. The city is surrendered with 5,500 defenders. This is going to be the biggest loss for the Americans during the war. Charles Cornwallis is going to become like the main British commander down in that area. And he at one point is going to join forces with Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold has now betrayed the Americans, and he has gone over to the British for money and believing that British troops would flock to his command. That doesn't really happen because they consider him to be a traitor as well. The man on the British side who had kind of tried to work out this arrangement with Arnold, Arnold was essentially going to hand over the plans for West Point. That British officer, John Andre, was captured, and that's how it all came out. And John Andre is going to be executed. Eventually, Cornwallis is going to end up in Yorktown, Virginia. The French by this time have come and over and are really providing support and help for Washington. And they're going to lay a siege on Yorktown. And on October 17th, 1781, Cornwallis sues for peace. And on October 19th, the British force of almost 8,000 marches out of the town. The final peace treaty was signed in September of 1783. And in December, Washington takes leave of his officers. He appears before the Continental Congress meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, to resign his commission, and then heads home to Mount Vernon, believing that he is finished with all public service. He's going to be wrong about that, but that's for another time.